This account's third part opens with a man whose arrival in the closing months of 1864 seemed, at the time, like one of the Shinsengumi's more fortunate recent developments, and whose eventual departure would produce one of the single most consequential internal crises in the entire organization's history. Ito Kashitaro arrived in Kyoto with a background that distinguished him considerably from the great majority of Shinsengumi members this account has so far introduced. He had been born in the Hitachi domain in the eastern part of the country and had studied not only swordsmanship, in which he held genuine and well-regarded credentials in the Hokushin Ito-ryu tradition, the same broader school Sannan Keisuke had trained in, but also classical scholarship, Confucian philosophy, and the specific body of political and historical thought that informed the broader Sono-Joi movement. This account has already spent considerable time describing. This combination, real swordsmanship credentials paired with genuine scholarly sophistication, made Ito a considerably more intellectually formidable figure than most of the organization's existing leadership, whose strength, this account has already established, lay overwhelmingly in martial discipline and practical organizational capability, rather than in classical learning or political theory. Kondo Isami, who had spent his entire adult life keenly aware of his own lack of formal scholarly credentials, a gap that had, on more than one occasion, placed him at a visible disadvantage when dealing with the more sophisticated court nobles and senior domain officials his rising status now regularly brought him into contact with, appears to have welcomed Ito's arrival with genuine and considerable enthusiasm, seeing in him exactly the kind of intellectual legitimacy the organization had never previously possessed. Ito did not arrive alone. He brought with him a small group of his own students and associates, men who had studied under him in Edo before his decision to travel to Kyoto and join the Shinsengumi, a detail that matters considerably for understanding how this entire episode eventually unfolded, because it meant that Ito's position within the organization, from the very beginning, carried a quality that most other officers' positions did not: a personal following, bound to him specifically rather than to the organization as a whole, that would remain intact and available to him regardless of what eventually happened between Ito and Kondo's own leadership. Kondo granted Ito a position of genuine seniority almost immediately, eventually appointing him to the role of Sambo, a kind of chief strategic advisor, a position that placed him within the organization's formal hierarchy, close to the very top, alongside Hijikata Toshizo himself. For roughly 2 years, this arrangement appears to have functioned reasonably well, at least on the surface. Ito performed his advisory duties competently by every surviving account, and the organization's continued growth and continued institutional success throughout 1865 and into 1866 suggests that whatever private reservations he may already have been developing about the organization's underlying political purpose, he kept them, during this period, largely to himself. But the underlying tension was real, and it grew, gradually but steadily, over these same 2 years, out of a genuine and fundamental contradiction that this account needs to state plainly. Ito's actual political convictions, whatever careful diplomacy he exercised in expressing them, leaned decisively toward the Sono-Joi cause, the very movement the Shinsengumi existed to suppress. This was not, in itself, an entirely unique situation. This account has already suggested in its earlier discussion of the broader political context surrounding the Shinsengumi's founding that many of the organization's own rank-and-file members held underlying sympathies regarding reverence for the emperor and unease about foreign influence that were not, in their basic substance, so different from the convictions held by many of the radical loyalists the organization spent its days hunting. What separated Shinsengumi members from their opponents, this account has argued, was not fundamentally a difference in underlying political conviction, but a difference in the specific, binding commitment each side had made. And, in Kondo's case specifically, an old-fashioned insistence that a promise once given was not something to be revisited simply because circumstances had changed. Ito, unlike the great majority of Shinsengumi rank-and-file members, possessed the scholarly sophistication to articulate this underlying tension explicitly, to himself and, increasingly over time, to the small circle of followers who had travelled with him from Edo. He appears to have concluded, gradually over 1865 and 1866, that his own position within an organisation dedicated to suppressing the very political cause he privately believed in had become, in a way that a man of his particular intellectual seriousness could not indefinitely ignore, a genuine contradiction demanding eventual resolution. The broader political context surrounding this period, which this account will describe in considerably more detail over its following sections, made Ito's private doubts increasingly difficult to set aside. The shogunate's political position, already showing real signs of strain at the time of Ito's original recruitment in 1864, continued to deteriorate steadily over the following 2 years. Through a failed punitive military expedition against Choshu, through the death of a shogun, through a general and increasingly visible erosion of the shogunate's practical authority, that even a casual observer, let alone a man of Ito's genuine political sophistication, could hardly fail to notice and interpret. By late 1867, Ito had concluded that his position within the Shinsengumi had become untenable, and he made a decision that would produce one of the organization's most serious internal crises. Rather than simply resigning quietly, in the manner that would have almost certainly resulted in the same fate that had befallen Sannan Keisuke 2 years earlier, Ito negotiated a formal, sanctioned departure, taking with him a group of loyal followers to establish a new organization entirely, one openly and explicitly aligned with the very cause the Shinsengumi had spent 5 years suppressing. This account will describe in its following sections exactly how this remarkable and genuinely unusual departure was negotiated, what the new organisation Ito founded actually did during its brief, separate existence, and how the Shinsengumi's leadership, faced with a former colleague who now possessed detailed knowledge of the organisation's methods and its internal weaknesses, ultimately resolved the crisis Ito's split had created, in an episode that would come to be remembered as one of the darkest single nights in the entire organisation's history. To understand why the shogunate's political position continued to erode throughout 1865 and 1866, even as the Shinsengumi itself continued to grow in strength and reputation, it is necessary to step back and look at a military campaign that this account has not yet properly described. The shogunate's second attempt to militarily punish Choshu for its role in the Kinmon incident. A campaign whose failure would prove, in retrospect, one of the clearest early signals that the shogunate's centuries-old authority was approaching its actual end. This account has already mentioned that a first punitive expedition against Choshu was ordered in the immediate aftermath of the Kinmon incident in the autumn of 1864. That first expedition, it is worth briefly explaining, achieved its stated objectives with relatively little actual fighting. Choshu's leadership, facing overwhelming shogunate-aligned forces and lacking clear support from other domains, chose to submit, executing several of the officials most associated with the Kinmon incident's planning and formally apologizing to the shogunate. A resolution that allowed the shogunate to claim a genuine, if somewhat hollow, victory without the risks and costs of actual large-scale combat. This apparent submission, however, did not settle Choshu's internal politics in the way the shogunate's leadership hoped. Within the domain itself, over the following year, a more radical faction, associated particularly with a rising young leader named Takasugi Shinsaku, gradually gained the upper hand over the more accommodating officials who had negotiated the first expedition's resolution. And by 1865, Choshu had, in practical terms, returned to open defiance of the shogunate's authority, rebuilding its military forces along increasingly modern lines, and refusing the shogunate's demands for further concessions. The shogunate, under continuing pressure from Aizu and other allied domains to demonstrate that its authority still commanded genuine respect, ordered a second punitive expedition in 1866, a campaign that this account's second part has already mentioned briefly in its discussion of the events surrounding Shogun Tokugawa Iemochi's death. It is worth now returning to this campaign in considerably more detail, because its outcome shaped everything that followed. This second expedition, unlike the first, resulted in genuine, sustained fighting across multiple fronts surrounding Choshu's territory, and it produced for the shogunate a result that its leadership had not seriously anticipated: a series of humiliating military defeats. Choshu's forces, reorganized under Takasugi's leadership and increasingly influenced by innovative military thinking that incorporated modern Western-style tactics, organization, and weaponry, proved considerably more capable than the shogunate's own forces, which remained, in most cases, organized along considerably more traditional lines. This disparity reflected a broader pattern that this account has already touched on in its discussion of the Shinsengumi's own eventual military obsolescence. Domains like Choshu and Satsuma, precisely because their political position had pushed them toward genuine innovation and towards serious engagement with Western military methods, had, by the mid-1860s, developed a level of military modernization that the shogunate's own, more conservative military establishment had not matched, despite the shogunate's considerably greater theoretical resources. The campaign dragged on through the summer of 1866, with shogunate forces suffering repeated setbacks on multiple fronts. And it was in the middle of this increasingly embarrassing campaign, in the 7th month of 1866, that Shogun Iemochi died in Osaka at the young age of 20, from what most accounts describe as a form of heart disease, though the surviving medical record from this period does not allow for full modern diagnostic certainty. Iemochi's death, occurring in the middle of an active and increasingly unsuccessful military campaign, forced an immediate and awkward political transition at precisely the moment the shogunate could least afford instability at its very top. A ceasefire was hastily negotiated to allow for a period of formal mourning and for the transition to a new shogun. A ceasefire that, in practical terms, simply froze the second expedition's already embarrassing outcome in place, with Choshu having successfully resisted the shogunate's punitive campaign in nearly every engagement that had actually been fought. The political significance of this outcome is difficult to overstate. For over 2 centuries, the shogunate's authority had rested in no small part on the general understanding that it possessed overwhelming military superiority over any individual domain that might consider open defiance. The second Choshu expedition's failure shattered this understanding in a way that no amount of subsequent political maneuvering could fully repair. Domains across the country, watching a single Western domain successfully resist the shogunate's own punitive military campaign, drew the obvious and consequential conclusion: the shogunate's military authority was no longer what it had once been, and its centuries-old claim to unquestioned dominance could, in practice, now be successfully challenged. This conclusion fed directly into the political realignment that this account's 4th part will eventually describe in full: the gradual and eventually decisive alliance between Choshu and its historical rival Satsuma, negotiated in considerable secrecy during exactly this period. An alliance that, once fully formed, would combine the military capability Choshu had just demonstrated against the shogunate's own forces with Satsuma's own considerable resources and its still nominal position, at this point in the story, among the shogunate's allies. For the Shinsengumi, watching these events unfold from Kyoto, the second Choshu expedition's failure represented a genuinely troubling development. Even though the organization itself had played no direct role in the actual fighting, which took place at considerable distance from Kyoto itself. Everything the organization had built its identity and its purpose around, Service to a shogunate whose authority was assumed to be fundamentally secure, however contested in the specific streets of Kyoto, was now visibly, undeniably in question, in a way that even the most loyal and most disciplined members of the organization could not entirely fail to notice. It is against this backdrop of visible shogunate weakness that Ito Kashitaro's own private doubts, this account's previous section has already described, must be understood. A man of Ito's genuine political sophistication, watching the shogunate's own punitive military campaign collapse in humiliating failure against a single Western domain, had, by the closing months of 1866, considerably more concrete evidence for his growing private conviction that the political order the Shinsengumi existed to defend was approaching its actual end. Evidence that made his eventual decision to formally separate from the organization considerably easier to understand than it might otherwise appear. Before this account moves forward into the political transition that followed Shogun Iemotsu's death, it is worth pausing over a smaller, more localized episode from this same general period. One that illustrates how the broader atmosphere of political tension continued to express itself in Kyoto's streets, even during stretches when no major military campaign was actively underway. In the winter months surrounding the transition of power following Iemotsu's death, a violent nighttime confrontation occurred near the Sanjo Bridge, the same general area of the city where the Ikedaya had stood 2 years earlier, an incident remembered in some contemporary accounts simply as the moonlit sword fight at Sanjo, Tsukio Sanjo Bashi no Ranjin. The specific circumstances of this incident, as best they can be reconstructed from the surviving contemporary accounts, involved a group of Shinsengumi members encountering a small party of suspected radical sympathizers in the streets near the bridge late at night. An encounter that escalated rapidly into open swordplay, conducted, as so much of this account's violence has been, in the particular darkness and uncertainty of Kyoto's nighttime streets, where the line between a legitimate law enforcement action and simple opportunistic violence could, in the heat of an actual confrontation, become genuinely difficult to draw with confidence, even for the men directly involved. This account mentions this episode not because it produced consequences on the scale of the Ikedaya or the Kinmon incident, but because it illustrates something important about the texture of ordinary Shinsengumi operations during this period. A texture that the organization's more famous, more dramatically consequential engagements can sometimes obscure. For every Ikedeya, there were dozens of smaller, less historically significant confrontations, patrol encounters that turned violent, suspected sympathizers questioned and sometimes killed in circumstances that never received the same careful documentation or the same later historical attention. An ongoing, grinding pattern of low-level violence that formed the actual daily texture of the organization's existence, far more consistently than its handful of truly famous knights ever did. Let us return now to the political transition following Iemotsu's death, because it set in motion changes that would, within 18 months, transform the entire political landscape the Shinsengumi had spent 4 years operating within. The man who succeeded Iemotsu as shogun was Tokugawa Yoshinobu, a figure this account has already introduced briefly in its earlier sections, and whose own political judgment and eventual decisions would prove decisive for the Shinsengumi's ultimate fate. Yoshinobu was, by nearly every contemporary account, a genuinely capable and genuinely intelligent political figure, considerably more attuned to the shogunate's actual weakening position than many of his predecessors or his own senior officials, a clarity of perception that would, paradoxically, make him considerably harder for the Shinsengumi's own straightforward, loyalty-based worldview to fully anticipate or accommodate. Yoshinobu formally assumed the shogunal title at the very end of 1866, inheriting an organization, in the broadest sense, whose military authority had just been visibly humiliated in the failed Second Choshu expedition, whose finances were under increasing strain, and whose fundamental legitimacy in the eyes of a growing number of domains across the country was, for the first time in over 2 centuries, genuinely and openly in question. It was in this atmosphere of visible shogunate weakness in the early months of 1867 that Kondo Isami received the formal recognition that this account's earlier sections have already mentioned: appointment to the rank of Hatamoto, a direct hereditary retainer of the shogun himself, a status that represented, for a man of Kondo's original background, the fulfillment of an ambition that would have seemed almost fantastical to the young dojo instructor training farmers' sons in a hard-packed dirt practice hall outside Edo, only 5 years earlier. This account has already reflected, in its second part, on the genuine pride Kondo appears to have taken in this achievement, and on the particular poignancy of its timing. He received this ultimate confirmation of his rise into the formal samurai hierarchy at almost exactly the moment when that hierarchy's own underlying foundations had become, in ways visible to any careful observer of the political landscape, genuinely and seriously unstable. It is worth adding here a detail this account has not yet described: the specific danger Kondo's rising prominence now exposed him to personally. As his name became increasingly associated, in the minds of imperial loyalists across the country, with the shogunate's continued suppression of their cause, he became, correspondingly, an increasingly attractive target for assassination, a danger that materialized directly in the early autumn of 1867, in an incident near Fushimi that this account's later sections will need to describe in some detail, when radical assailants ambushed Kondo on the road and wounded him seriously enough in the shoulder that his fighting capacity, for the remaining months of his life, was never fully what it had once been. For now, though, in the early months of 1867, Kondo remained at the height of his personal prestige, newly elevated to formal samurai status, still leading an organization that, whatever the broader political ground shifting beneath it, remained genuinely feared and genuinely effective within Kyoto's own streets. What awaited him over the following 20 months was a sequence of political developments moving with an accelerating speed that even his own considerable organizational discipline and considerable personal courage would ultimately prove unable to withstand. A shogun's own decision to formally surrender the authority Kondo had built his entire adult identity around serving, a devastating military defeat, and, in the final chapter of his own remarkable rise from obscurity, a death that this account's fourth part will need to describe with the same honest, unflinching attention it has tried to bring to every other difficult episode in this long chronicle. Let us return now to Ito Kashitaro, and to the specific mechanism through which his growing private doubts about the Shinsengumi's political purpose finally resolved themselves into an actual, formal separation from the organization, an episode that unfolded during the same months in the second half of 1867, when the broader shogunate political crisis this account has just described was reaching its own point of maximum intensity. Ito's departure, when it finally came, was negotiated rather than simply carried out. And the specific form it took reveals something genuinely distinctive about how this particular internal crisis differed from the organization's earlier experience with internal dissent. Rather than attempting a quiet, unauthorized flight in the manner Sannan Keisuke had attempted 2 years earlier, an approach this account has already shown ended in tragedy, Ito instead proposed, to Kondo directly, a formally sanctioned separation, framed not as desertion, but as a reassignment to a new and, on its surface, entirely legitimate duty. The specific cover Ito constructed for this departure was genuinely clever and worth explaining in some detail. He proposed that he and his followers be released from the Shinsengumi's ranks in order to take on a new, specific responsibility, serving as guardians of the imperial tombs, Goryoeji, a genuinely legitimate and even prestigious duty within the broader political and ceremonial landscape of the period, one that carried none of the immediately suspicious quality that a simple request to leave the organization outright would have carried. Whether Kondo genuinely believed this cover story, or understood at some level that Ito's underlying motivations extended considerably further than an interest in tomb guardianship, is a question the surviving sources do not allow this account to answer with full confidence. What can be said is that Kondo, for whatever combination of genuine trust, political calculation, and simple reluctance to repeat the violent internal reckoning that had characterized the organization's handling of both Serizawa Kamo and Sannan, granted Ito's request, and in the autumn of 1867, Ito departed the Shinsengumi along with a group of roughly 15 loyal followers, taking up residence at Kodaiji, a temple in Kyoto's eastern Higashiyama district, from which their new organization took the informal name history would remember them by: Kodaiji-to, the Kodaiji faction. The Kodaiji-to's actual activities during its brief separate existence extended considerably beyond the ceremonial tomb-guarding duties its formal cover story described. Ito and his followers used their new independence to pursue increasingly open contact with imperial loyalist figures and domains, particularly Satsuma, whose own political position, this account has already noted, was in the process of shifting decisively away from its earlier alignment with the shogunate and toward the emerging alliance with Choshu that would soon reshape the entire national political landscape. This activity placed the Kodaiji-to and Ito personally in an increasingly precarious position. He had left the Shinsengumi under a cover story that granted him formal legitimacy and, crucially, allowed him to depart without triggering the lethal consequences the organization's own Kyokchu Hatto would otherwise have demanded. But his actual political activities, once he was free of the Shinsengumi's direct daily oversight, moved him steadily and visibly toward exactly the political alignment his former organization existed to oppose. A contradiction that Kondo and Hijikata Toshizo could not indefinitely ignore, particularly once it became clear that Ito possessed detailed, intimate knowledge of the Shinsengumi's own internal methods, its membership, its informant networks, and its operational weaknesses. Knowledge that, in the hands of an increasingly open imperial loyalist sympathizer, represented a genuine and serious security risk. There is also a more personal dimension to this growing rift that several later accounts describe, though this account, in keeping with its established commitment to honesty about the limits of what the surviving evidence actually supports, wants to present it with appropriate caution. Some sources suggest that Ito, during his time within the Shinsengumi's senior leadership, had come to harbour genuine ambitions of eventually supplanting Kondo's own position of authority, ambitions that, whether or not they played any direct role in his eventual departure, would have added a considerably more personal and more threatening dimension to the growing estrangement between the two men, beyond the purely ideological differences this account has already described. Whatever the precise mixture of ideological conviction, practical political calculation, and personal ambition that drove Ito's trajectory during these final months, the Shinsengumi's leadership, by the closing weeks of 1867, had concluded that the Kodaiji-to's continued independent existence and Ito's continued access to imperial loyalist circles, armed with his intimate knowledge of Shinsengumi operations, represented a threat serious enough to demand the same kind of decisive, permanent resolution this account has already described the organization applying to Serizawa 4 years earlier. The specific method chosen for this resolution, and the night in November 1867 when it was actually carried out, would come to be remembered as one of the most morally troubling single episodes in the Shinsengumi's entire history. An episode this account's following section will need to describe, with the same unflinching honesty it has tried to bring to every other difficult moment in this long chronicle. Because what happened at Aburanokoji on that particular November night represents, in the clearest possible terms, exactly what this account has already suggested about the Shinsengumi's underlying character. an organization capable of genuine loyalty and genuine discipline, and, when its own survival seemed to require it, capable of a ruthlessness that extended even to men who had once sat among its own most senior leadership. On the night of the 18th day of the 11th month, 1867, Ito Kashitaro was invited to Kondo Isami's residence in Kyoto, ostensibly for an evening of conversation and drinking between two men whose formal relationship, whatever its underlying tensions, had never been publicly severed. Ito, whether from genuine trust in Kondo's continued goodwill, or from a more calculated assessment that refusing the invitation would itself arouse suspicion, accepted. What followed set the pattern for the violence that would unfold later that same night. Ito drank with Kondo for some hours, by most surviving accounts in an atmosphere of apparently genuine cordiality, before setting out, in the deepening night, to return to his own lodgings at Kodaiji. He did not complete that journey. Near the intersection at Aburano-koji, Shinsengumi, swordsman, positioned in advance and waiting specifically for this moment, ambushed him and killed him in the street. This account wants to sit, briefly, with the specific method chosen here, because it differs in a meaningful way from the pattern established in Serizawa Kamo's killing 4 years earlier. Serizawa had been killed quietly, in his own quarters, asleep, with a cover story constructed afterward to obscure what had actually happened. Ito was killed in the open street, his body deliberately left visible rather than concealed, a choice that appears, from the surviving accounts, to have been entirely deliberate rather than accidental. The reasoning behind this choice becomes clear when the events of the following hours are considered. Shinsengumi, leadership, anticipated, correctly, that Ito's remaining followers at Kodaiji, upon learning of his death, would come to recover his body. And it was this anticipated response that the organization's leadership had actually planned for. Ito's corpse, left in the street at Aburano-koji, functioned as deliberate bait, intended to draw the remaining Kodaiji members out of their temple lodgings and into a location where the Shinsengumi could confront and eliminate them as a group, rather than needing to mount a more difficult assault against a fortified temple position. The plan succeeded in its immediate tactical objective. When several of Ito's followers arrived at Aburano-koji to retrieve his body, Shinsengumi swordsmen, positioned in ambush, attacked them as well. In the fighting that followed, several more Kodaiji members were killed, including Todo Heisuke, whose story this account has already followed since the Ikadaya raid 3 years earlier, when he had fought alongside Kondo and Nagakura Shinpachi and suffered the serious head wound that had, for a time, removed him from active combat. Todo's death at Aburano-koji carries a particular weight within this account's larger narrative, because it represents something this chronicle has already suggested runs throughout the Shinsengumi's entire history. A young man who had fought bravely and effectively for the organization for years, who had bled for it at the Ikadaya, ultimately killed by that same organization once his personal loyalty shifted, however genuinely or however gradually, toward a cause the organization itself existed to suppress. The line between comrade and enemy within this particular story proved again and again to be considerably less stable than the organization's own severe internal discipline might have suggested it should be. Not every member of the Kodaishito died that night. Several, including Shino Haratai no Shin and notably Miki Saburo, Ito's own younger brother, managed to escape the ambush and survive, finding refuge in the immediate aftermath with sympathetic domains, and eventually making their way into more secure imperial loyalist territory, where they would, within less than a year, find themselves in a position to exact a very direct and very personal form of retribution against their former organization. A development this account's fourth part will describe when it reaches the specific circumstances of Kondo's eventual capture. This detail is worth flagging now, because it illustrates something important about the limits of even the Shinsengumi's most carefully planned violence. The survivors of Aburanokoji, scattered but alive, carried with them both detailed knowledge of Shinsengumi operations and a very personal motivation for revenge. A combination that would return to affect this story's outcome in ways that Kondo and Hijikata Toshizo, in the immediate aftermath of what must have seemed at the time like a successfully executed operation, could not have fully anticipated. The Aburanokoji incident, taken as a whole, represents perhaps the starkest single illustration this entire account has yet offered of the Shinsengumi's defining internal logic, carried to its most extreme and most morally troubling conclusion. Ito had been, for nearly 3 years, a senior officer within the organization's own leadership, a man whose scholarly sophistication had specifically sought out and specifically valued. His death was not a battlefield casualty, struck down by an anonymous enemy in the heat of open combat, but a deliberately planned assassination, carried out against a man who had, by every account, drunk companionably with his eventual killer only hours before his death, using his own corpse afterward as bait to draw out and kill his remaining followers. This account does not believe it can offer a clean moral verdict on this episode that the actual historical complexity genuinely supports. Ito's own political activities, once free of the Shinsengumi's direct oversight, had moved him into increasingly open cooperation with domains actively working toward the shogunate's overthrow. Cooperation that carried genuine security implications for an organization whose survival depended on secrecy and operational effectiveness. From Hijikata's own consistent internal logic, the same logic that had already justified the deaths of Serizawa and Sannan, Ito's continued freedom, armed with his intimate knowledge of Shinsengumi methods, represented exactly the kind of existential threat the organization's severe discipline had always been designed to eliminate. But this account also does not want to lose sight of what this logic actually required in its most extreme application: the calculated killing of a former comrade, using his own body as bait to lure his remaining followers to their deaths, carried out by an organization whose banner, this account has already discussed at some length, displayed the single character Makoto, sincerity, as its defining claimed virtue. Whatever internal consistency this account has tried to identify in the Shinsengumi's broader pattern of behavior, Aburanokoji represents a moment where that consistency produced an outcome that even the organization's own most sympathetic later chroniclers have generally struggled to describe as anything other than what it plainly was: a calculated, cold-blooded elimination of men who had, until recently, called themselves the organization's own comrades. It is worth noting, as this section closes, that this episode unfolded barely more than a week before an event that would, within days, render nearly all of the Shinsengumi's careful internal calculations about survival and political positioning almost entirely moot. On the 9th day of the 11th month, just over a week before Ito's death at Aburanokoji, Shogun Yoshinobu had already, in a decision this account's next section will examine in full, formally submitted his resignation as shogun to the emperor, surrendering, at least on paper, the very governing authority that everything this organization had done, including the killing that had just occurred in the streets near Aburanokoji, had been undertaken to defend. To understand the decision Shogun Yoshinobu made in November of 1867, a decision this account's previous section has already mentioned in passing, it is necessary to look closely at the specific political calculation behind it, because it represents one of the most consequential and, in certain respects, most genuinely surprising choices made by any figure in this entire chronicle. By the autumn of 1867, Yoshinobu faced a political landscape that had deteriorated, in ways this account has already traced across its preceding sections. to a point where the shogunate's continued survival in anything resembling its traditional form had become genuinely doubtful. The second Choshu expedition's humiliating failure had shattered the assumption of overwhelming shogunate military superiority. The secret alliance between Choshu and Satsuma, negotiated during roughly this same period through the mediation of figures including Sakamoto Ryoma, a figure this account has not yet had occasion to introduce, but whose behind-the-scenes political work proved genuinely decisive in bringing these two historically hostile domains into cooperation, had combined the military and political resources of two of the country's most powerful domains squarely against continued shogunate authority. Yoshinobu, reading this deteriorating situation with a clarity that distinguished him from several of his predecessors, appears to have concluded that attempting to preserve the shogunate's traditional governing authority through continued military confrontation risked a war the shogunate might well lose outright. A war that could potentially destroy the Tokugawa house entirely, along with whatever residual political influence it might otherwise retain, even after surrendering direct governing power. His solution, formally submitted to the imperial court on the 9th day of the 11th month, 1867, was an act remembered as Taisei Hokan, the restoration of imperial rule, or, more literally, the return of the great governance. In this formal declaration, Yoshinobu voluntarily surrendered the shogunate's centuries-old claim to governing authority over Japan, returning that authority, at least in its formal legal sense, to the emperor. The same emperor whose person and whose court, the Shinsengumi, only a little over 3 years earlier, had helped defend against Choshu's forces at the Kinmon incident. This decision, on its surface, appeared to represent a genuinely remarkable act of political self-sacrifice. A shogun voluntarily relinquishing power his family had held for over 2.5 centuries, rather than risk a potentially catastrophic war to preserve it by force. But Yoshinobu's actual calculation, as best it can be reconstructed from his subsequent behaviour and from the accounts of contemporaries who understood his thinking, was considerably more sophisticated than simple self-sacrifice. And it is worth explaining that calculation in some detail, because it directly shapes everything that happened over the following 14 months. Yoshinobu appears to have believed, or at least to have genuinely hoped, that surrendering formal governing authority would not, in practice, mean surrendering all meaningful political influence. Japan's actual governing apparatus, its administrative structures, its diplomatic relationships with foreign powers, its practical, financial and military resources remained, even after this formal declaration, overwhelmingly concentrated within the Tokugawa house and its extensive network of allied and directly controlled domains. Yoshinobu's calculation, in essence, was that a new governing council, formed under the emperor's nominal authority, but drawing on this practical Tokugawa strength, would necessarily require his own continued central participation, allowing him to retain substantial practical influence even after surrendering the shogunate's formal title. This calculation, whatever its internal logic, proved to be a serious miscalculation. Satsuma and Choshu's leadership, along with sympathetic figures within the imperial court itself, moved with considerable speed and considerable political skill to ensure that Yoshinobu's hoped-for continued influence never materialized. Less than a month after Taisei Hokan, on the 9th day of the 12th month, 1867, these forces orchestrated a formal proclamation known as Osei Fukko no Daigore, the Great Proclamation of the Restoration of Imperial Rule, which went considerably further than Yoshinobu's own declaration had specified, formally abolishing the shogunate as an institution entirely, along with the senior court advisory positions Yoshinobu had hoped might preserve some formal channel for his continued influence, and establishing a new provisional government, explicitly excluding Yoshinobu and the Tokugawa house from any formal leadership role. For the Shinsengumi, watching these developments unfold from Kyoto over the closing weeks of 1867 This sequence of events represented a genuinely disorienting political transformation, arriving within days of the organization's own violent internal reckoning with Ito Kashitaro and his followers at Aburano-Koji. The entire political order the organization had spent nearly 5 years defending, the shogunate's claim to legitimate governing authority, had, within the span of a single month, been formally dissolved. First through Yoshinobu's own voluntary surrender, and then, more decisively, through the imperial proclamation that stripped away even the residual influence Yoshinobu had hoped to retain. This account wants to pause here on the genuine strangeness of the Shinsengumi's position at this precise historical moment. The organization had built its entire institutional identity and each individual member's entire personal sense of purpose around service to the shogunate, and, through the shogunate, to the emperor, whose authority the shogunate had always formally claimed to be exercising on his behalf. Now, within the span of weeks, the shogunate itself had ceased to exist as a formal governing institution, even as the emperor himself, the same figure the organization had always claimed to be ultimately serving, remained very much in place. His authority, at least in formal terms, actually enhanced rather than diminished by everything that had just occurred. For men like Kondo Isami and Hijikata Toshizo, whose entire adult identities had been built around a specific personal loyalty to Yoshinobu and to the Tokugawa house Yoshinobu represented, rather than to any more abstract concept of imperial authority in the general sense, this formal dissolution of the shogunate did not, in practice, produce any meaningful reconsideration of where their own loyalties actually lay. They remained committed to Yoshinobu personally and to the broader Tokugawa cause his house represented, regardless of what formal title that cause now carried, or failed to carry, within the new political order the imperial proclamation had just established. This continued personal loyalty, unwavering even as its formal institutional basis dissolved beneath it, set the Shinsengumi, along with Aizu and the broader coalition of domains that remained committed to the Tokugawa cause, on a collision course with the new Satsuma Choshu-dominated provisional government that the following weeks would make increasingly, and eventually violently, unavoidable. That collision, when it finally came, at the very start of 1868, would take the form of a battle whose outcome would determine, within the space of only 3 days, the fate of everything this account's remaining sections still have left to describe. This account has already mentioned in passing the ambush that seriously wounded Kondo Isami in the early autumn of 1867, but the episode deserves fuller treatment here, both because of its lasting physical consequences for Kondo personally, and because it illustrates, with particular clarity, exactly how dangerous his own rising fame had made him by this point in the story. The attack occurred on the 18th day of the 12th month by some accounts, or somewhat earlier in the autumn by others, the surviving sources showing some genuine inconsistency about the precise date, as Kondo travelled by palanquin along a road near Fushimi, south of Kyoto proper, returning from a visit connected to his official duties. A group of assailants, generally identified in most accounts as men connected to the surviving remnant of the core Daijito, Ito Kashitaro's former followers who had escaped the ambush at Aburano-Koji, and had, in the weeks since, been actively seeking an opportunity for direct retribution against the man they held responsible for their former leader's death, attacked the palanquin without warning. This account has already noted that several Kodaijito survivors, including Shinohara Yasunoshin and Ito's own younger brother, Miki Saburo, escaped the Aburano-Koji killings and found refuge with sympathetic imperial loyalist domains in the immediate aftermath. It was, by most reliable accounts, men drawn from exactly this surviving remnant who carried out the Fushimi ambush. A direct and personal act of revenge that connects this episode explicitly back to the violence this account's previous sections have already described, rather than representing some separate, unconnected act of political violence. Kondo was struck by gunfire during the attack, The specific wound generally described as striking his right shoulder, an injury serious enough that he was unable to continue his journey under his own power and had to be carried to safety and placed under medical care. The wound, while not immediately life-threatening, proved to have lasting consequences. Surviving accounts from the following months consistently describe Kondo as operating with diminished strength and diminished mobility in his sword arm. A genuinely serious handicap for a man whose entire identity and whose entire claim to the formal samurai status he had only recently achieved rested fundamentally on his prowess as a swordsman. This account wants to sit, briefly, with the layered irony this specific episode represents within the larger story it has been telling. Kondo, a man who had built his entire adult identity around relentless swordsmanship training, who had risen from an obscure rural dojo instructor to formal samurai status, specifically through demonstrated combat skill, was brought down not by an opponent's superior swordsmanship in the kind of direct confrontation his entire life had prepared him for, but by gunfire, delivered from ambush, by men whose grievance traced directly back to a killing his own organization had carried out, using exactly the kind of calculated, premeditated violence this account has already discussed at some length in its account of the Aburanokoji incident. There is a kind of grim symmetry here that this account does not want to overstate through excessive literary framing, but also does not want to pass over entirely. Kondo had ordered, or at minimum approved, the killing of a former comrade using ambush tactics and a corpse used as deliberate bait. Weeks later, he himself fell victim to an ambush carried out by men avenging exactly that killing, using a weapon, the firearm, that represented precisely the kind of modern military technology this account has already suggested was steadily rendering the Shinsengumi's core swordsmanship expertise increasingly obsolete on any battlefield beyond the narrow, controlled environment of Kyoto's own streets and alleys. The practical consequences of this injury extended well beyond Kondo's personal physical condition, though those personal consequences were significant enough on their own. With their commander operating at reduced combat capacity during precisely the period when the broader political crisis this account's previous sections have described was accelerating toward what would soon become open warfare, day-to-day operational leadership of the Shinsengumi fell increasingly to Hijikata Toshizo, a shift in practical authority that, while not formally altering the organization's official command structure, meant that Hijikata's own judgment and Hijikata's own decisions carried increasing practical weight during the critical weeks leading up to the war that would, within a matter of months, determine the Shinsengumi's ultimate fate. Kondo himself, by every account of his conduct during his recovery, remained determined to continue leading the organization despite his diminished physical condition. A determination that speaks to the same underlying character trait this account has emphasized throughout its earlier sections. A man who took commitment seriously, who did not regard a serious setback, even one as significant as a debilitating gunshot wound, as sufficient reason to step back from responsibilities he had spent his entire adult life working to earn the right to hold. This determination would carry him forward through the final catastrophic months of the Shinsengumi's existence as a coherent fighting force. Through the opening battle of the war, this account's fourth part will describe in detail, and ultimately toward his own capture and death. Still, by every indication in the surviving record, operating with a body that had never fully recovered from the wound he suffered on that road near Fushimi, in the final weeks before everything the organization had spent 5 years building began, with genuinely startling speed, to come apart entirely. Before this account's third part can properly close, it needs to explain, more fully than its earlier passing references have done, the specific alliance that made everything happening in the closing weeks of 1867 possible, and to describe the increasingly tense atmosphere that settled over Kyoto and Osaka as that year gave way to 1868. This account has already mentioned the alliance between Satsuma and Choshu, negotiated with the crucial mediation of Sakamoto Ryoma. But it is worth explaining why this alliance was, in itself, such a remarkable political development. Satsuma and Choshu were not natural partners. The two domains carried a long history of genuine rivalry, and, more immediately relevant to this account's own narrative, Satsuma had stood alongside Aizu and the Shinsengumi during the August 18th coup of 1863, actively participating in Choshu's expulsion from Kyoto, and had likewise fought against Choshu's forces during the Kinmon incident the following year. Engagements this account has already described in some detail in its earlier sections. That Satsuma's leadership, within roughly 2 years of fighting directly against Choshu in Kyoto's own streets, would enter into a secret military and political alliance with that same domain, reflects the depth of the broader political transformation this account has been tracing across its third part. Satsuma's leadership, watching the shogunate's own political and military authority erode steadily through the failed Second Choshu expedition and through the broader pattern of administrative and financial strain this account has already touched upon, concluded by 1866, that its own domain's long-term interests would be better served by aligning with Choshu against continued shogunate dominance than by continuing to prop up an institution whose future increasingly appeared limited. This alliance, formalized in early 1866 and kept substantially secret from the shogunate and its allies for a considerable period afterward, combined Choshu's demonstrated military capability, proven against the shogunate's own forces in the second expedition, with Satsuma's own considerable resources and its still nominal, though rapidly eroding, position among the shogunate's allies. A combination that would prove, within less than 2 years, decisive. For Aizu and the Shinsengumi, the growing evidence of this alliance, even before its full extent became publicly clear, represented a genuinely alarming development. Satsuma's forces remained physically present within Kyoto throughout this period, maintaining the outward appearance of continued cooperation with the shogunate and Aizu, even as its actual political alignment shifted decisively toward the opposing camp. A situation that produced an atmosphere of genuine and growing mutual suspicion, within a city where shogunate loyalist and imperial restorationist forces now found themselves operating in uncomfortably close physical proximity. Each side increasingly uncertain which of its ostensible allies could actually still be trusted. This atmosphere of mounting suspicion intensified dramatically following the imperial proclamation of the 12th month, 1867, which this account's previous section has already described, formally abolishing the shogunate and excluding Yoshinobu from the new provisional government's leadership. Yoshinobu himself, along with a substantial body of loyal forces, including significant elements of the Shinsengumi, withdrew from Kyoto to Osaka Castle in the immediate aftermath of this proclamation. A withdrawal that several contemporary accounts describe less as an orderly strategic repositioning than as something closer to an angry, humiliated retreat. Yoshinobu and his supporters removing themselves from a Kyoto whose political institutions had, within the span of a single month, been fundamentally reorganized to exclude them entirely. From Osaka, throughout the final weeks of 1867 and into the opening days of 1868, Yoshinobu's court and his allied domains, Aizu prominent among them, engaged in increasingly tense negotiations and, simultaneously, increasingly serious military preparations, uncertain whether the new provisional government's exclusion of the Tokugawa House represented a final, settled political arrangement that might yet be negotiated into something more favourable, or whether it represented, as an increasing number of Yoshinobu's own supporters had begun to argue with growing urgency, an intolerable humiliation that only a direct military response could adequately answer. The Shinsengumi itself, during these final weeks of 1867, underwent a further significant transformation in its own composition and character. With Kondo still recovering from his Fushimi wound, and with the organization's entire institutional purpose increasingly uncertain amid the broader political dissolution unfolding around it. Hijikata Toshizo worked to consolidate and reorganize the remaining forces, absorbing several smaller allied Ronin groups into the Shinsengumi's own structure, and continuing, even amid this atmosphere of mounting political crisis, the same disciplined training regimen that had defined the organization since its earliest days in Mibu. There is something worth noting in this final period before open warfare actually broke out, about the particular psychological position these men found themselves occupying. They had spent nearly 5 years building an organization whose entire institutional identity rested on service to the shogunate, an institution that had, within the span of little more than a month, been formally dissolved by imperial proclamation. And yet their actual daily activity during these final weeks of 1867, the training, the patrol duties, the organizational consolidation, continued to oversee, proceeded with a consistency that suggests these men had not, in any meaningful practical sense, reconsidered their fundamental purpose or their fundamental loyalty, regardless of what formal political changes had just occurred around them. By the final days of 1867, the atmosphere in both Kyoto and Osaka had become genuinely combustible, with Yoshinobu's supporters increasingly convinced that the new Satsuma Choshu-dominated provisional government intended not merely to exclude the Tokugawa house from political power, but to seize its extensive remaining landholdings and financial resources entirely. A conviction that, whatever its precise accuracy, provided exactly the kind of urgent, existential justification that would soon tip the delicate, tense standoff between these two armed camps into the open warfare this account's fourth part must now turn to describe in full. Let us pause here at the close of this account's second part and take stock of where the Shinsengumi actually stood in the middle years of the 1860s, before this larger chronicle moves on to the political crises that would eventually unravel everything this organization had built. By the end of 1865, the Shinsengumi was, by nearly every external measure, a genuine success. It numbered well over 200 men, organized into 10 disciplined squads under experienced captains. It commanded real fear and real respect throughout Kyoto, a reputation built on the twin foundations of the Ikadaya raid and the Kinmon incident. Two engagements that had transformed an obscure provincial police auxiliary into one of the most recognized names in the entire country. It enjoyed the continued sponsorship of Aizu, the growing respect of the broader shogunate hierarchy, and a level of institutional stability that would have seemed almost unimaginable to the small, uncertain group of leftover Ronin who had settled into Mibu's farmhouses 2.5 years earlier. Kondo Isami himself had travelled a distance, in these same 2.5 years, that few men of his original background could ever have realistically hoped to travel. From an obscure rural dojo instructor, teaching farmers' sons in a hard-packed dirt training hall on the edge of Edo, to a figure received with genuine respect by senior shogunate officials, his name recognized throughout Kyoto and increasingly throughout the country. His organization treated as one of the shogunate's most valuable and most reliable instruments in its ongoing struggle to hold Kyoto, and with it the broader political order the shogunate had governed for 2.5 centuries, together against the mounting pressures of imperial restoration. But this account has also tried, throughout its second part, to hold this external success alongside its genuine internal costs. Costs this account does not believe an honest telling of this story can responsibly leave out. The organization's severe internal discipline, embodied in the Kyokuchu hut that Hijikata Toshizo had built specifically to hold a rapidly expanding, increasingly diverse membership together, had already claimed the life of Sannan Keisuke, a founding officer whose actual threat to the organization's survival remained, even by this account's own honest assessment, genuinely uncertain. The organization's growing fame had come at a real cost to the city it operated within, a cost visible in the tens of thousands of buildings destroyed in the fires that followed the Kinmon incident, a catastrophe that, whatever its complicated causation, grew directly out of the same political conflict the Shinsengumi had positioned itself so prominently within. And beneath the surface of this organization's continued growth and continued success, a young man named Okita Soji, still only in his early 20s, was carrying, invisibly and unknowingly, the first quiet beginnings of an illness that would, within a handful of years, end his life, long before any of the political questions this larger conflict was still working to resolve had themselves been settled. This account has tried, throughout its second part, to resist the temptation to tell this story as a simple narrative of rising triumph, because the actual historical record does not support such a simple narrative. And because this account believes, as it stated in its very opening section, that the Shinsengumi's story is worth telling honestly in its full complexity, rather than smoothed into either uncomplicated heroism or uncomplicated villainy. What comes next, in this account's third part, is the period during which the political ground beneath the Shinsengumi's feet began, slowly and then with increasing speed, to shift in ways that even the organization's growing strength and growing discipline could not ultimately withstand. The arrival of Ito Kashitaro and the internal schism his own political sympathies would eventually produce. The shogunate's mounting political difficulties as the broader conflict between shogunal authority and imperial restoration continued to intensify, and the beginning of the specific sequence of events that would, within less than 3 years from where this account's second part now leaves the Shinsengumi, bring the entire political order these men had given their lives to defend crashing down around them. None of this was yet visible in the closing months of 1865 to the men still training in Mibu's practice yards, still patrolling Kyoto streets in their light blue jackets, still gathering, in whatever quiet hours their duties allowed, in the tea houses and entertainment districts this account has just finished describing. They knew only what any of us can ever know, living through our own particular moment, the present circumstances of their own lives, whatever fame or security or quiet private happiness those circumstances currently provided, and no clear sight at all of how much or how little time remained before everything they had built together would begin inexorably to come apart.